good afternoon, and thank you very much for those of you who are online. I want to thank Dr. Trahey for organizing this time together. I'm pleased that I'm a part of the process. Before I begin, I'm going to read you a piece that I wrote specifically for this talk today. Our Blackness renders us invisible under the white gaze. They say it is a crime to be who we are, but we ask for so little to live our lives in peace. Yet we are indiscriminately hunted like wild animals, choked, shot, wrestled, squeezed, muzzled. The sound of death visiting our bodies as they squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, the life slowly drains from our bodies. The choir of those gone before us sing, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. In the middle of grieving these murderous losses, before we get a chance to recover, another one is gone. Bam, bam, bam. Andrew Loco, 19 seconds, Rambo style, executed. We have white boys with killing toys snuffing out our bodies, our babies' lives, broken bones, bloody face, a lost eyeball. Hands up, don't shoot. Defonte Miller is here to stay, challenging the blue line who are crying out, we're afraid for our lives. I'm afraid for my life. I was afraid, yet they can still breathe while the system has their backs and their unions refuse to budge. They walk free. Christian Theriault, where is the justice? We know that Black lives matter. So my talk is really focused on whose words matter when we talk about anti-Black racism. And I will be speaking specifically about anti-Black racism and in Newfoundland and Labrador. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, people appear to be waking up to the realization that anti-Black racism exists here in our province. It is not too late, and I am encouraged at the new voices that have chimed in to support our call for not only the acknowledgement of anti-Black racism, but also to a call to action. But we are at a crossroads here, and our next move is important. I say this with certainty that Newfoundland and Labrador will become one of the beacons of hope to fight anti-Black racism in the Atlantic region and in Canada. But here is the challenge. We need to throw off the shackles of multiculturalism and diversity and step into the 21st century. How do we do that? First, let us get clear on what multiculturalism actually is and how it has nothing to do with anti-Black racism. Deceased former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau is credited with Canada's Multiculturalism Act of 1985 that was supposed to help create a multi-ethnic society where different languages and cultures could be accepted, integrated, and preserved in the Canadian society. Unfortunately, that goal was not realized given that ethnic, mostly racialized communities clamored for scraps of funding thrown from the federal government's table, and as Dion Brand noted, created deep divides within and among community groups who were and still are considered not quite Canadian. We were encouraged to share our foods, sing cultural songs, and share folklore for a few days of the year. In Toronto, we even had a multiculturalism picnic. Then we shared bits and pieces of our lives like caricatures, so white Canadians could gaze at us, touch our hair, nibble on our foods, knowing that comments about bad smelling foods and odd hairstyles were unacceptable for those few days. That was the 1980s. And now we're in 2020, so 20 years after the turn of the century, and people in this province are still talking about multiculturalism. I'm here to tell you that multiculturalism is dead, and to remind you that the notion is antiquated, stymies progress around anti-Black racism, lacks critical perspectives, and is highly problematic. We also need to understand that those who are carrying the mantle of multiculturalism and diversity are dangerous to anti-Black racism and to the Black Lives Matter movement because of their complicity with whiteness. Let multiculturalism rest in peace. This means that when we talk about anti-Black racism, the discussion and actions must be specific, meaningful, and aligned with the scholarship, practice, and activism of anti-Black racism. This brings me to the piece around whose voice needs to be heard and centered in the anti-Black racism and Black Lives Matter discussions. Well, Black people have different experiences, ideas, and visions. Therefore, we should not be expected to have the same opinions. We're not monolithic. Having said that, we can no longer afford to have a liberal, class-based approach to anti-Black racism in Newfoundland and Labrador. Nor can we accept the watered-down silencing of the Black experience and the pain at the expense of our people. The scholarship, practice, and activism have shifted to include a deeper understanding of how anti-Black racism operates in society and the insidious mechanisms that enables it. People who are considered to be nice and use soft, palatable, acceptable language. Those who are more invested in being liked, or who are unaware of the inner workings of systemic anti-Black racism, tend to position themselves as not having racism, experiencing racism, or minimizing the extent of their experiences with racism. Those attitudes are threats to anti-Black racism progression and the Black Lives Matter movement, and they ultimately provide white society with additional ammunition to further fuel and deny the existence of anti-Black racism. So, how do we deal with this tension? Well, we need to understand that simply being Black does not equate to a commitment or understanding of anti-Black racism. And it also does not translate into a willingness to work towards the eradication of anti-Black racism. When people speak about anti-Black racism and Black Lives Matter concerns, we need to ask on whose behalf do they speak? Anyone who is using the Black Lives Matter slogan or anti-Black racism must have a solid understanding and commitment to its values, vision, and goals, and need to be involved with community-based Black Lives Matter activities. This means that they must be connected to the community movement because Black Lives Matter is a grassroots, community-based movement. It is fierce, unapologetic, action-oriented, coalition building with one central focus, and that is to eradicate anti-Black racism. There's no mixing of words with diversity or multiculturalism. People like to engage with those of us who do not directly challenge anti-Black racism or their work, politics, practice, power, and privilege. Those in power prefer to collaborate with those of us that ask for less and settle for dribs and drabs, say the things that make them feel comfortable, adhere to the status quo by towing the line, and are unthreatening to their power sources and structures. It is tempting then to want to gather Black bodies at this time to show your solidarity with Black people. And it is even more tempting to want to set your own agenda by choosing your Black lives and anti-Black racism representatives. Please know that our faces and bodies are different from those that espouse a diversity and multiculturalism perspective. So do not make the mistake of being on the wrong side of history. When a professional bus driver is given a noose and told to hang himself, when we see the Confederate flag flying freely and openly, and when the police is called on children, Black children, it is anti-Black racism, not multiculturalism or diversity. Those of us who fight anti-Black racism and use the Black Lives Matter slogan are seeking education, labor and economic justice for being scrutinized and targeted, for being expelled from school so that we couldn't get an education, for not being hired for jobs that we're qualified for, and then being harassed on those jobs when we get them, for being denied mortgage loans and a place to live so that our families are broken, for violating and brutalizing our children as young as 8 years old by handcuffing them, holding us as hostage in the prison industrial complex, and for denying us justice when we are wronged, and then blaming us on top of it. We want to destabilize inequity, level the playing field, uproot capitalism, and set anti-Black racism on its head. This is a call to action to all politicians, federal and provincial agencies, school boards, corporations, post-secondary institutions, decision makers, movers, leaders, shakers, and any other entity that currently focuses on diversity and multiculturalism. To stop using anti-Black racism, stop using the anti-Black racism term, and stop using the Black Lives Matter slogan until you can respond to our call for action to consistently and seriously commit to working towards the eradication of anti-Black racism, because Black Lives Matter right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mullings. Our next presenter is Dr. Paul Banhene Adjei. Dr. Adjei is an associate professor and chair of the PhD program at Memorial's School of Social Work. His research and scholarship draw on anti-Black racism theory, critical race theories, critical whiteness studies, and anti-colonial theory. Dr. Adjei.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, thank you. There's a video that I want to open it, so please bear with me, and then.
Yes, we can see it, but you don't have it in present mode. Oh, there you go.
Okay. So it's just a minute, many of you are familiar with this story, but I want to use it as a context to also do my presentation.
Yeah, just to let you know, we don't have the sound there now. We're not hearing the video.
Oh.
No, sorry, we can't hear the sound. There's subtitles at the bottom of the video, but we couldn't hear the sound. Can you, I think your mic is muted. Thanks. I think Dr. Adjei is going to set that up again for us. Okay.
Folks, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about the mess. I was just trying to, figure my way out. This is a new thing for me. So I will just, skip the PowerPoint presentation and just go ahead and tell you the gist of the story. This video, how many of you have seen it? Okay, so we've had some folks who have already seen it, but those of you who haven't seen the story, it's one of the story that was trending on YouTube, and it was a very popular story. It was about Christian Cooper. Christian Cooper is a Harvard, graduate, and she is also a bird watcher. And he happened to have met Amy Cooper, or they have no relation. Amy Cooper is a Canadian living and working in the United States. She is a graduate of University of Waterloo, and also has an MBA degree from University of Chicago. And she works as a VP and head of investment for Franklin Templeton in New York. Now, I'm giving you a gist of her background just to segue the conversation in a very broader context, because oftentimes when we talk about anti-Black racism or or racism, we tend to presume that it is the work of people who are ignorant or people who are not progressive enough. Well, in this particular encounter, Amy Cooper was walking her dog at the Central Park in New York. and she was walking her dog in an area that the law says that the dog is supposed to be on leash. But in this particular case, she has unleashed the dog, and the dog was roaming around. So Christian Cooper, asked her if she could, leash her dog, given the fact that it was against regulation. And the outcome was what Amy Cooper said to, Christian Cooper, that, well, stop recording me, because, Christian was recording her. And she wondered if he doesn't stop recording him, he is going to call the police, and said that an African American man is threatening her life. Now, I want us at this moment to reflect this particular conversation and the way it unfolded. Well, there have been, when the video came out, Amy Cooper came out and apologized, because there were a lot of public rage against her behavior. Not to mention that she lost her job, and also the dog was taken away from her. But she came out and apologized and said that she didn't know that her behavior was considered as threatening, because she was afraid, and she is not racist. But I want us to look at this particular moment to see how whiteness manifests itself, and how the presence of whiteness in many ways become a form of weapon that put the lives of Black people at risk. In many ways, Amy Cooper was not ignorant of history, because she is very much familiar with the historical and anti-Black racism in both Canada and US, where in many times white sense of fear and fragility has become a form of weapon that has been mobilized against Black lives. Again, there are a few examples that I can give. For instance, in 1916, Jeff Brown, who was a Black male, in an attempt to rush to take a train, bumped into a white girl. The white girl cried, that her life was threatened. And within a short time, Jeff Brown was, lynched and killed in the United States. In 1930, Deneice Hobart, a Black student at Morehouse College, also got himself lynched for speaking to a white woman at a public park. We can also talk about the story of Emmett Till, where in 1955, he was alleged to have whistled to a white woman. And for doing that, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy, was lynched, but it was the manner of the lynching that was very instructive here. His tongue was cut off, his penis was cut off, they broke his nose with an axe. And it's a reminder of trying to demonstrate a desire towards a white woman, even though later this white woman in question, who was a 55-year-old, confessed that she made the story up. We also know the infamous story of the Black, Wall Street at Tulsa, and the circumstances that led to the destruction of Black investment and businesses in the United States, and the killing of many Black people. Again, in this particular instances, it was a white woman who cried that he has been sexually harassed in an elevator by a Black man, and that was the reason to start the route. What I'm trying to say is that in this particular encounter, when Amy Cooper intentionally warned Christian Cooper that if you don't stop recording me, I'm going to call police and tell them that an African American male is threatening my life, she was employing history. She knows very well whose life will be in danger when police shows up. She knows very well that the state institution will not hesitate, including killing Christian Cooper for being a threat to a white life. But I want us to look at this encounter not as a simple case of an individual who behaved irresponsibly, but look at the whole conversation in a broader sense in terms of how historically and in contemporary times whiteness continued to manifest itself in different and diverse ways that put Black lives at risk. And it is important that we cannot talk about anti-Black racism in this historical moment without first looking at the complexity and the manner in which whiteness is implicated in this situation. You know, an article was recently written in Toronto Star in response to what happened, you know, to Amy Cooper, and the article titled "Re-examine the Amy Cooper in All of Us." And the author was in a way inviting white people to examine that the tendency for us, even though they claim to be nice and good, can sometimes reproduce a racial violence. And in our school system, given the fact that this conversation is about educators, I think it's also very important to situate this conversation in the broader school system. How many times have the encounter between Black student and non-Black student positioned Black student as a threat and has resulted in cases of suspension and sometimes dismissal in our school system? How many times within the school system has Black student been perceived as violent and individual that poses a threat to their white student? And here there are a lot of examples to draw from. So for instance, when we look at the Toronto District School Board, you know, in Ontario, we know instances of the number of Black students that have been suspended in the school system because they were considered to be having a behavior problem. They were in this particular context presumed to be guilty, and without even given an opportunity to defend themselves, or even where they have an explanation to give, their explanation, you know, is being dismissed. There are a few points that I want to leave behind, even as we all reflect through what happened between Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper. And the first thing is that we need, as a way of combating anti-Black racism in our school system, to acknowledge our individual and collective responsibility. You know, the notion that one is not, you know, the notion or the idea that our target is to act not to be racist is not enough. Because, you know, if our goal is not to be racist, then I believe that the bar is too low. And in many ways, not being racist do not necessarily translate into anti-racism. Again, we need to dismiss this notion of, you know, this moral argument that, well, I can't be racist because I am a good person. I can't be anti-Black racist because I have a lot of, you know, Black friends, or I am nice to Black people. Because it is possible to be racist and still be a very good person. I mean, there are a lot of historical examples to demonstrate that. Again, we need to move away from this notion of color blindness, because the notion of being color blind as a way of, you know, trying to treat everybody the same itself is a form of racism that we reproduce on Black bodies. Because as I keep mentioning, if you right now don't see a Black person in front of you, then you are not colorblind in terms of being politically strategic. But physiologically, you are colorblind, and probably you need to see a medical doctor. But here is the struggle around this whole notion of colorblindness. For a society that claims to be colorblind, there is always a test, and we call it the waiter's test. We have this waiter who claimed that he has a problem with accounting. In other words, he's not good with mathematics. So anytime he's giving change to customers, he ends up giving them less. And anytime that question is posed, his argument is that, well, I am not good with math. That is why I short exchange, you know, customers. But here is the, you know, the way in which we can measure the truthiness of this claim. If indeed the argument of the waiter is that he is not mathematically inclined, that is why he end up giving less change to customers, then it should have been a situation where in some situation he will give more to customers. Then at that point we can say that, well, he is not mathematically inclined. That is why whenever he is offering change, he can give more or less. Now, here is the broader reflection. For a society that we claim to be colorblind, isn't it interesting that many positions of power and influence are always occupied by white people? How could colorblind society manage to identify whiteness when it matters most? This is a very important question that we need to deal with if we are going to deal with anti-Black racism in society. And finally, we also need to look at the hidden curriculum in our school system, because there is an invisible way in which Black bodies are always made to feel unwelcome in our school system. So even though we say, that our school is, diversified, we are inclusive, and we welcome everybody, but there is an invisible sign that sometimes make Black bodies feel unwelcome in our school system. It is like you are being invited to a Thanksgiving dinner and you show up and there is no table for you. And in many ways, that is how our school system and the curriculum have been designed. There is no representation of our history in the curriculum. We don't have representation in the teaching board. We don't have any representation in the school administration. We are made to feel like we are an afterthought. We are not the main focus in the school system. And therefore, if we are to address anti-Black racism within our school system, then we must be open and address this hidden curriculum that continue to send a signal to some students that they are not part of the school system, while others are made to feel entitled that the school belongs to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Adjei. And following our final presentation, we'll be taking your questions through the chat functions. But if you have any questions and you'd like to type them in now, please do that. And so that right after the our final presentation, we'll be ready to go with your questions. Okay, now, our next presenter is Dr. Sulaimon Giwa. Dr. Giwa is an assistant professor at Memorial School of Social Work with a cross appointment to the Department of Sociology, Police Studies. He's the endowed chair in criminology and criminal justice at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. His research interests are in the areas of race and sexuality, critical social work pedagogy, anti-Black racism, oppression, and the criminal justice system. Dr. Giwa.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Good afternoon, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of today's panel. This is a revolutionary time in history to be Black. In the midst of the revolutionary struggle for freedom, racial equality, and social change, many Black critical activists, change makers, and thinkers are showing the way forward. Their continued effort to expose the deep-rooted systemic inequities and anti-Black racism in our world is critical for bringing about the societal and structural transformation that is profoundly needed. Achieving structural transformation, as we continue to see, won't be easy because of powerful white elites' investment in ideological and material benefits of whiteness. White people are not immune from the denial, erasure, or obfuscation of racial salience, which contribute to the maintenance of the status quo and undermine the fight against systemic anti-Black racism. This tactic of denial is not accidental. Its design is intentional insofar that the denial creates a defensive shield that prevents against addressing the remnants of past and current vestiges of white supremacy. Since May 26, 2020, the world's attention has been gripped by the uprising and unrest surrounding the public execution of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. From these rebellions has emerged calls for reform, police accountability, and demands for governments to defund or, in some cases, to dismantle and abolish the police. While important, these conversations have leveraged Black death, pain, and intergenerational trauma as exemplars of the systemic racism committed against Black people. This storyline requires a course correction. The problem with this plot is that it requires Black people, through their constant retelling of their stories of oppression and dehumanization, death, pain, grief, and trauma, to prove their humanity and worth, in the hope that doing so will ingratiate white people to their sense of humanity. Such burden of responsibility placed on the shoulders of Black people is not only unfair, but it functions to absolve white people of the need to examine their own understanding and awareness of systemic anti-Black racism. This past week, we saw the RCMP commissioner, Brenda Locke, first denied that systemic racism existed in the RCMP. A couple of days later, and perhaps due to pressures from within and outside of the RCMP, she said that unconscious bias existed in the RCMP. However, while testifying before the House of Commons Public Safety Committee, doing a study of systemic racism in policing, she struggled to articulate an informed understanding of systemic racism. She equated physical aptitude tests as analogous to systemic racism. When Commissioner Locke said that systemic racism did not exist, but later suggested that unconscious bias did, it is hard to reconcile these opposing statements in the short time span they were conveyed. This reversal, in my mind, amounts to performative speech act. Regardless, it is easy to see how the rush to invoke unconscious bias can be weaponized to dismiss or to silence critics. If everyone can be guilty of unconscious bias, why should the RCMP be held to a higher standard? There is a danger that unconscious bias is slowly becoming the new racism. As the leader of a national police organization, Commissioner Locke's lack of understanding and awareness of systemic racism in policing is troubling but not surprising. Her own difficulty to comprehend this concept is made into a collective Black and Indigenous omission to offer a clear definition of the term. Black and Indigenous people have always been clear about what systemic racism is and how it manifests itself in everyday life. The tome of official reports on the conditions of Black and Indigenous life in Canada is evidence of this fact. Commissioner Locke is not alone in this regard, however. Her comments echo the long-standing views of other police leaders across Canada who have not only denied the problem of systemic racism, but also failed to engage with the issue of anti-Black racism. The situation of Commissioner Locke is illustrative of the ways in which white denial, obfuscation, and erasure of difference is allowed to persist under the guise of white innocence. Her poor treatment of this issue raised questions about her understanding of the urgency to address systemic racism in the RCMP and may explain the growing call for her resignation. It will be inadequate, of course, to limit my analysis to Commissioner Locke, since she is emblematic of the symptom but not the root cause of the problem of white supremacy and anti-Black racism within and outside of policing. Anti-Black racism is deeply entrenched in the social fabric of Canadian society. However, this fact has been obscured because of Canada's multiculturalism policy, which has and continues to extol the multicultural and inclusive character of the nation. With legislated equality in the form of charter rights and multiculturalism policy, it becomes inconceivable that systemic racism and anti-Black racism could be thought to exist in Canada. This would go against white people's image of themselves and of Canada. Because white people have a vested interest in the idea of Canada as a colorblind society, they are blinded to their own role and complicity in perpetuating systemic racism, anti-Black racism, and oppression. For too long, the Canadian Black experience was made irrelevant and inconsequential. This was possible because in the Great White North, Black lives were an afterthought to white imagination of citizenship and nation building. It took the murder of George Floyd, an American, for a great number of white people to become sensitized to, or at least demonstrate a modicum of interest in understanding the impact of anti-Black racism on Black people in Canada. On the other end, a great many white Canadians remain unmoved by the global Black Lives Matter movement for change. This is not at all surprising. Notions of Black inferiority and dangerousness are built into our institutions, which result in the social and economic disparities found in the legal and criminal justice system, the education system, the child welfare system, in healthcare, housing, and employment. Colonial discourses of inferiority and dangerousness have proved effective tropes in keeping Black people in their proverbial place. This thinking has served to validate the white knows best attitude, which has systematically denied Black people equal access to the same opportunities afforded to white people. There are a number of steps and actions that could be taken to begin to address anti-Black racism in Canada. One immediate action is for those in leadership and powerful positions to acknowledge that systemic racism and anti-Black racism exists and is embedded in the institutional practices of government and non-government decision-making, programs, and services. This acknowledgement is a prerequisite to addressing systemic anti-Black racism in Canada. Anti-Black racism must be centered in our discussion of Black Lives Matter. To be blunt, I am concerned about the rising appropriation of this statement to advance other issues and agenda that stray far from its original meaning, intention, and focus. This is another way that Black issues and concerns get pushed to the periphery of public consciousness and inaction. We must demand from government a greater investment in Black people and communities. The time of incremental piecemeal actions have come and gone. Fundamental change to the structure of all aspects of society is crucial to increase Black communities' capacity and engagement with government processes, which will hopefully break down institutionalized obstacles to Black progress. We must become less tolerant of institutional leaders who demonstrate little to no understanding or regard for Black lives in their words and or in their action. How much longer do Black people need to wait for justice? At what point does the push for more education become less about effecting change and more about preserving the existing state of affairs? We must do away with, or at the very least, acknowledge the failed experiment of multiculturalism, which has not eradicated racial discrimination or allowed Blacks to be treated fairly and equitably. On the contrary, this hegemonic cultural discourse has allowed white Canadians to ignore or avoid difficult conversations about race, racism, and anti-Black racism. Discussion of multiculturalism in the context of sharing of cross-cultural food practices or garbs are insufficient to address entrenched structural inequality. Now more than ever, discussion about Black lives has gained traction. White allies must leverage this opportunity to advance Black lives in all areas of social life. To remain silent in the face of ongoing Black struggle is to be complicit in the system of oppression against Black people and communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Giwa. And thank you to all our presenters for their insightful and thought-provoking presentations. Okay, we have some questions now that I'm going to read. Okay, one question. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. So one question is, someone asked, I'm wondering about some strategies you would suggest to help with the issue of color blindness, as I feel this is a common issue. So that's for either of our presenters to respond. Thank you.
I will start, and I'm sure others will have something to say. The first strategy is for us to understand that taking color blindness position is a form of racism. Because when you are colorblind, it is not just the body that you are not seeing. You are also not seeing the mind history. You are not seeing mind struggle. And you are not seeing the experience that is connected to my skin color. But in many ways, you are also not seeing yourself in terms of color. And in many ways, it's also explained why many white people don't have to see white as a form of color, because it's considered as, neutral. So the color blindness notion, one strategy of dealing with that is that to understand that it is a racist offense. And in many ways, it's very offensive to racialized body when we evoke it as a way of suggesting that we see the common humanity in people. In other words, it is possible to see me as human being and still see me as Black. You don't have to de-race me in order to see me as as a Black person, or in order to relate to me. So to suggest that, well, you don't see me as Black, but you see me as human, is extremely offensive.
Okay, thank you. Any of the other presenters would like to respond to that? Dr. Mullings? No? Okay. All right, I can go to the next question. What is one thing an educator can regularly do or practice to notice unconscious bias and to address it? Dr. Mullings or Dr. Giwa?
So I think one of the things that I was expressing in my presentation is a concern about unconscious bias and the ways in which we utilize or even come to try to understand what it means. So I would suggest that one of the first things we need to be doing is to be asking ourselves the questions of what are we really trying to say when we are referring to unconscious bias? What does that really mean in the context of the work that we're doing and in terms of how we want to effect change? Because I think it is increasingly becoming a default kind of perspective or approach that we are taking to our understanding of racism, anti-Black racism, and any other kind of form of oppression. Because I think it's a way to kind of absolve ourselves of the important responsibility that we have to begin to critically and creatively challenge and push back against systems of oppression. So I would say that the question we should be asking ourselves is, what are we intending to do when we are deploying the language of unconscious bias? And I think that therein lies the kind of responses that we need to be engaging in if we can begin to ask those kind of critical questions.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'll go to the next question. What would be the most important or initial thing for a school to do in order to be open and welcoming and prevent anti-Black racism? What would be the most important or initial thing for a school to do?
Maybe I'll take that question. So the thing to consider is that both Dr. Giwa and Dr. Adjei talked about some of the systemic ills and anti-Black racism specifically in the school system. So I would wonder what is the leadership like in the school? What is the principal doing? Because in Newfoundland, we talk a lot about welcoming, but those of us who come to the province, there's no such thing as welcoming, really. So, and I think we need to move past the idea of being welcoming to people and start looking at how to eradicate anti-Black racism. And you do that, some of the ways you do that is by acknowledging that anti-Black racism exists, by ensuring that you have Black people inside the school system that is in positions of power and decision making so that students can actually see their own role models. You make sure that you have curriculum material that reflects the Black experience. And, there are other things that happens in the school system, whereas, police is called on some of the Black students as a disciplinary means. Those kinds of activities need to not happen. And stereotypes around Black students' aptitude, their academic abilities, those need to be addressed. And so Black students need to be seen as being as capable as any other student in the classroom or in the school as other students. And they ought to be given the respect as every other student. So those are some very basic things.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mullings.
In addition to that, we also need to talk about whiteness and white privilege and how it continues to reproduce racial violence on Black, brown, and indigenous bodies. Because at the heart of anti-Black racism is the notion of whiteness and how whiteness continue to remain invisible in our schools. One of the struggles that have always come up within the school system is the way in which the curriculum itself has been designed in a way to espouse and introduce students at the early stage of their education to whiteness and the supremacy of white ideology and white values. So one way that as our school could do in terms of addressing anti-Black racism is to also ensure that we speak about whiteness. And again, as it has already been added by Dr. Mullings, we must also introduce the curriculum, increase the curriculum in a way that also speaks to diverse history, diverse experience of different bodies. Because our current curriculum in many ways continue to speak about white values. It makes it sound like while others people are asleep, it was only white people who were developing the world. They were the only one who brought civilization. So why is it in that white students at the early stage have a sense that they are superior because they were the only people who contributed to the civilization of our human race? But we all know that that is not entirely true. Other society and communities have contributed to the history of our humanity. Where are those history in the curriculum? I think that all these are some of the steps that could be done to address anti-Black racism in our school system.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Adjei. Our next question, as a white educator in a position of influence on addressing anti-Black racism in the education system, what response would you like to see from me?
I will take a quick bat, and I'm sure my colleagues will have something to say about that. I always say that by virtue of who you are as a white person, there are certain doors that are going to be open to you. And what I expect in many ways is when you get access to those doors, how are you going to open it wide to ensure that racial inequities are addressed? In other words, are you going to use that position, that privileged position that you hold, to create opportunities for racialized bodies, for Black bodies into position of influence? Are you going to use it to hire more Black teachers and indigenous teachers in the school system? Are you going to use it to ensure that Black students get into administrative positions? These are the expectations, because we all know that our system has been designed in such a way that when we talk about the concept of meritocracy, it espouse whiteness and white values in a way that certain bodies will never get opportunities. And so as somebody who is a white person who occupy influential role, one of the expectations is that you will use that role to create a change.
Okay, thank you. Adjei?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting, it's a good, solid question, but what I would wonder is, given the 3 presentations that you've heard today and the numerous suggestions of what can be done in the school system, and given your position of influence and privilege, which one of these numerous things could you implement? That's what I would wonder. Because I don't think we necessarily want to reinvent the wheel. Each environment is uniquely different. They have different strengths and areas to be improved, latitude or flexibility. And so that's what I would wonder. I'm not necessarily, trying to put you on the spot to say exactly what is, but I think it's a good question to turn the camera in on yourself to see what you can actually do of what some of the things that you've heard here today.
Okay.
And if I could just maybe add a quick point to that. I think it's also really important, and I think this is the one mistake that we continuously make, is to think about these systems not as being independent of the larger system that we all kind of exist in. So in other words, the education system is a microcosm of the entire system of our world, right? So many of the changes that we are putting forward are things that we can also take into the educational system in terms of how we actually make the kind of transformation and change that we need to see, right? So, as some of my colleagues, the panelists have already kind of alluded to, like, looking around and thinking about the diversity and the makeup of the faculty membership, the staff, right? But what are some of the other things that you're doing to kind of advance Black issues and Black agenda and Black lives within the school spaces, beyond just the multiculturalism fair that you may have every February, right? What are we doing year round to make sure that the voices and the experiences and the contributions of Black people in Canadian society actually gets reflected, across the board, so that students actually get a better sense of some of the contributions that Black people have made and continue to make to the social fabric of Canada.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm sort of looking at the time now. We have 2 minutes to the end of this, but I'll ask another question here. Given the emotional heaviness of the discussions on race, how can we as elementary and secondary educators effectively engage our students?
I think it's a misnomer to think that students are too young to begin to understand about race. And I actually have a lived experience at the moment where we're going through that kind of situation where we're encountering race and trying to deal with how that kind of manifests for a little boy here. So I think beginning early and talking about it often, I think is one way that we can remove the sting and the stigma of actually talking about race, right? Because even as adults, we struggle to talk about race, racism, anti-Black racism, and how they actually manifest in our world. And we find different tactics as a way to kind of avoid and be evasive in terms around this issue. But I think if we can begin really, really early with the students and actually create opportunities for them to learn, to make mistakes, but also to grow, I think that might be a better way forward in terms of actually, normalizing this conversation that needs to be really happening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and to add to that, I always say that we should learn to be comfortable with the discomfort that comes with talking about race. And that is why sometimes I struggle with this response that, well, as a white person, I don't want to say something wrong, and therefore I don't want to talk about race. Because racism is not a Black or brown or indigenous people problem. It was Steve Bantu Biko who said, the South African activist, who said that, why should we concern about a problem which is not our creation? Racism have never been a Black people problem. It is white people's problem. And therefore, this conversation must including the discomfort that comes with that. I think that we should not confuse the discomfort that comes with talking about race with the avoidance to talk, to deal with racism altogether. So as early as younger age, I think that we need to introduce our younger ones to the conversation around race, to the point where they will learn to be comfortable with the discomfort that comes with it.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Can I just very quickly add to that? I actually want to debunk this idea of uncomfortableness and uncomfortable conversation. I think that's a place where we tend to hang our hats, and we have lots of different kinds of conversations, but yet when we talk about racism, we very quickly talk about the uncomfortableness of it. So I'd like to push that a little bit further by asking, what is this uncomfortableness or this discomfort about? And what are people willing to do to step or to move past it, rather than sort of like, using it as a hook, as Dr. Adjei, pointed out. So all conversations can be difficult and all conversations can be enlightening, and it's a matter of finding the middle ground with having conversations about racism without wanting to run through the door.
Thank you, Dr. Mullings. Dr. Giwa, Dr. Adjei would like to add anything to that? Oh, we'll just take one more question. We have time for one more question, so we'll try to squeeze this one in. And it is, what is something an individual person can do, someone who's not connected at the leadership level and not in control of government spending? Okay, Dr. Adjei?
Okay, thanks. The first thing I will add is that the individual should not be silent about, racial violence in our society. I think that it is very important that as a collective voice, it's not only Black bodies or indigenous bodies or bodies of color that should be allowed to talk about racism when it happens. It also means that when our colleagues, or somebody speak about their racial experience, we should not trivialize it. We should not dismiss it. We should not even attempt to rationalize it. We should be able to listen to what the person is saying and also contribute to the discussion in terms of way in which we can address systemic and institutional racism. I also believe in numbers, and throughout our human society and our human struggle, all struggle have been very successful when we have a lot of voice collectively involved in pushing against the status quo. And I think it is within this context that we need to understand that even when we are not in a leadership position, our voice could still make a difference in terms of speaking with other voices to address the systemic injustices and oppression and racism in our society.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Adjei. Would you like to add anything to that, Dr. Giwa, Dr. Mullings? I think your mic is off, Dr. Giwa. Oh, I thought you were saying something there in a moment.
Yeah,
okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So I think one other thing that I will add to that is I think it's really, really important for white people as well, as allies, to also be conscious about the voices that they are listening to and the voices that they are choosing to advance on the particular issues of racism and anti-Black racism specifically. I think that, there's a tendency to want to think that because, all Black people are just, they look the same and therefore they all kind of have the same kind of politics and whatnot. And that's not necessarily true. There's some, Black people who are pro-Trump, and there are some many Black people who are not pro-Trump. So I think that we need to be careful about the kind of voices that we are pushing out, because that can actually be damaging to the political kind of agenda that we are trying to advance. So being an ally is also being sensitive to the tenor and the temperament of the folks who are articulating certain kind of issues. And we need to be careful about those issues and agenda that they're pushing, because it can actually do a damage and set the movement backward. So that's just something I'll put out there.
Okay, thank you very much. Any last word from Dr. Mullings?
No, I just want to echo what Dr. Giwa said, to be mindful of whose voices we're centering. And if it feels too comfortable that you're not feeling any butterflies in your belly when you're talking about anti-Black racism, then it probably means that you're not doing the work.
Okay, thank you very much. And a sincere appreciation to Dr. Mullings and Dr. Adjei and Dr. Giwa. Thank you so much. Thanks. Give him a clap. Thanks to TESL NL, the executive, for organizing the session. Please stay tuned for more exciting events from TESL, Newfoundland and Labrador. Thank you so much and have a great summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloydetta. That was excellent. And thank you to all three professors.